Shaaloani is weird, and here's why. Shaaloani is, in my opinion, the weakest zone in Dawn Trail, and I want to talk about why, and why I think this might be the case. I want to begin by saying that I am not talking about its weakness as an isolated zone with its own narrative. I think taken by itself, Shaaloani is fine. I think the way it at once represents and subverts the iconography of the Old West by depicting an indigenous territory negotiating the domestic politics between technological advances and traditional ways of life, and as a frontier confronting the sudden invasion of a foreign hostile power is novel and interesting. For a desert biome, something FF14 has in abundance, it also remains visually arresting, and its background music is among my favourite in the expansion. However, Shaaloani's position in Dawn Trail is both narratively and structurally strange. It is a core part of Tuliola's sphere of influence, and yet plays no part in the Rite of Succession. Moreover, we encounter it as a messy sutra between the Rite of Succession and Alexandria's invasion, a kind of intermission that causes the Warrior of Light to miss key story revelations like the reveal of Kryle's origins. The initial story arc about local corruption and self-governance is, while appropriate, disconnected in plot, if not theme, from the rest of the expansion. It gives us a moment of time with Erenville, which, while welcome, feels overly belated. Moreover, the way it plays host to the scene of Turali unity as our allies rally to reinforce the train ahead of the assault on the dome is narratively slightly strange, given that the characters we are assisting are ones we functionally met about 10 minutes ago. Compare this to similar scenes in Shadowbringers or even Stormblood, where the assault on Mount Gulg brings together allies throughout the expansion, and the ones on Castle Doma and Alamigo bring together allies forged in their respective region and in the expansion as a whole. Basically, Shaaloani is weird, and I'm going to explain why I think that is. The TLDR version is, I think Shaaloani is a holdover from an earlier planned version of Dawn Trail, and it was originally intended as one of the expansion's 2 starting zones. I have this opinion both because of Shaaloani itself, and also because I find that Dawn Trail's starting zones are themselves also kind of strange. To preface this, let's briefly look back at previous Final Fantasy XIV expansions. In Heavenswood, the Warrior of Light accompanies one of the 2 Fortance brothers to distinct zones, where we learn about their respective issues and push the story forward in distinct ways. Same with Stormblood. Even if the story beats dovetail more closely around the Alamigo occupation, we still accompany distinct NPCs and gain distinct insights into that occupation. In Shadowbringers, Felucia and Amarang have us reunite with the twins separately and see different sides of the aftermath of the Flood of Light. In Endwalker, we accompany different scions to Labyrinthos and Thavnair and discover different information relevant to the ongoing story. In Dawn Trail, by contrast, our starting zones have us accompanied by an almost identical cast of NPCs and follow almost identical plot beats. In both, Uklamat visits one of Tural's cultural groups, realizes she has no idea about anything, and overcomes a narrative hurdle in order to gain deeper understanding of that culture. While we interact with different contestants, Zeralja and Urkapacha and Kona and Bakujaja and Kozamauka, the overall plot beats are remarkably similar. As an aside, I feel this is one of the key reasons Uklamat comes over as incredibly weakly written in early Dawn Trail. She essentially spends the opening hours of the expansion having the same narrative arc twice. Not only is this redundancy strange, it's also at odds with the narrative structure of previous expansions. I think this is because at some point in development, these zones were not actually intended to be the starting zones, and the initial setup of the story was probably quite different, or at least slightly different. Dawn Trail is unique and arguably uniquely suffers from its pre-expansion patch cycle. Every previous expansion had 1 or 2 main patches of narrative setup, Heavenswood in 2.4 and 2.5, Stormblood in the end of 3.4 and 3.5, Shadowbringers in 4.4 and 4.5, and Walker in the end of 5.4 and 5.5. Dawn Trail only has 6.55 as set up. Everything before was devoted to the Void Gaiden arc. Because of this, it's difficult to say how much in advance the core structure of Dawn Trail was hammered out relative to previous expansions. However, I would not be surprised if it underwent some late overhauls, relatively speaking. I suspect in the initial outline for Dawn Trail, the Warrior of Light was likely meant to begin as an unaligned actor in the Rite of Succession, perhaps brought in by Gulul Jar Jar directly, or mainly accompanying Kryl in her journey of self-discovery. In this initial version, your alignment between either Wuk-Lamat or Kona would have been, technically, undecided, and your initial starting zones would have been accompanying Wuk-Lamat to either Kozama-Uka or Okapacha, and accompanying Kona to Shaaloani, likely with their respective scion bodyguards, and maybe also Erenville, who would similarly not have been as aligned at this point, and probably served as our general guide to Turali culture and living. One reason for me to have this train of thought is that Kona's entire character arc is tied to Shaaloani as a zone. Shaaloani is where the conflict between technology and tradition, the core of his initial arc, plays out. It is also broadly where he is from, geographically speaking, and where he ultimately discovers the truth of his origins and concludes his personal arc in 7.1. Accompanying Kona to Shaaloani in the opening act of the expansion would have highlighted the flaws in his worldview and readiness to rule in a similar way to how the current starting zones highlight Wuk-Lamat's, twice. It would also have allowed us to meet local NPCs in a way that better set up the later train construction sequence. As an aside, it's kind of weird that Kona's entire backstory is tied to his studying in Shaaloani, and yet we never once encounter him there. This feels like something that could have easily gone into a 6.4 or 6.5 patch during a normal pre-expansion cycle. Now, I do ultimately think the story would have played out very similarly. That is, the Warrior of Light would ultimately side with Wuk-Lamat, Kona would decide she was the better ruler and throw his weight behind her in Yaktel, and she would similarly realize her own weaknesses and appoint him as the Vow of Reason. It is simply that the initial setup would have left our options conceptually more open, and given us a closer insight into the strengths and weaknesses of the two main candidates. My guess is that at some point early in development this storyline was deemed unfeasible, possibly due to time and an effort at streamlining, and so the early expansion experience was rejigged. In the process, Shaaloani was moved from a starting zone to its current position as an intermission between Dawn Trail's two major arcs. Similarly, one of the Yok-Chiral zones was then reshaped into a new second starting zone. Somewhere along the way, the narrative plot beats got repeated and we ended up with the current structure. Kona's backstory and character resolution, meanwhile, was ultimately pushed out of the expansion proper and ended up in 7.1, where it also awkwardly sits as a kind of loose end that it was necessary to tie up before we could get back to the important plot beats in Alexandria. I do think that the current position of Shaaloani has some merits. Our introduction to Warlika and the train crew coming where it does, for example, primes the player to expect shard-based shenanigans just before Alexandria makes its explosive entrance. Moreover, its general function as an intermission arc reinforces its role as a form of borderland, the space where an indigenous culture confronts an outside force that arrives suddenly without precedent or warning. These are things that I think make Shaaloani's current position work on a plot and thematic level, but Shaaloani is still weird, and this is why.